You think you've seen entitled neighbors before? Wait until you meet the Karen sisters to women who believed they ruled the whole neighborhood just because they lived in the biggest house on the block. They acted like everything and everyone belonged to them. If someone planted flowers, they complained the colors hurt their eyes. If kids laughed too loudly, they called it disturbing the peace. But their worst habit was For months, these sisters secretly used their neighbors' Wi-Fi. Without asking, without paying, they streamed movies, downloaded games, and even bragged to other people about how fast their internet was. The neighbors had no idea until their bill skyrocketed. Finally, fed up, the neighbors changed their Wi-Fi password. That's when the storm exploded. The Karen sisters went absolutely wild, screaming that they were being personally attacked, claiming it was illegal to cut them off, and threatening to call the police. Their tantrums shocked everyone on the street. But here's the twist. They weren't just stealing internet. They were also logged into the neighbor's Netflix account, which instantly kicked them out the moment the password changed. In seconds, their endless streaming of soap operas and reality shows vanished. No more late-night binge-watching. No more bragging about premium access. Their empire of freeloading collapsed in an instant. What followed was a meltdown so loud and dramatic it could have been its own Netflix series. The sisters marched to the neighbor's door, demanded access back, and even tried to gather other neighbors to join their side. But instead of gaining sympathy, they exposed just how ridiculous, selfish, and entitled they really were. And trust me, the ending of this story is sweeter than any TV drama they'll never stream again. Asterisk. The Karen sisters had always been a strange sight in the neighborhood. They lived together in the biggest house on the block, a wide two-story home painted an off-white color that looked more yellow than clean. Their curtains were always drawn tight, except for the occasional time one of them peeked outside to glare at children riding bikes or couples walking their dogs. People whispered about them, not because they were mysterious, but because they were loud, bossy, and utterly convinced that everything around them somehow belonged to them. The eldest sister, Janice, was tall, sharp-featured, and spoke in a booming voice that could be heard from half a street away. She was the self-proclaimed leader, always acting as though she knew better than anyone else. Her youngest sister, Paula, was shorter, heavier, and had a dramatic flair that made even the smallest inconvenience look like a tragedy. Together, they formed what the neighbors jokingly referred to as the Double Trouble of Elm Street. Every few days, one of them would be seen wagging a finger at some poor delivery man, or shouting at kids for playing too loudly, or complaining about the smell of barbecue smoke drifting from a cookout for months. Though the sisters had a little secret that none of the neighbors knew. Late at night, once the rest of the block had quieted down, they sat together on their worn leather couch, their faces lit up by the bluish glow of a flat-screen TV. What powered their endless nights of entertainment wasn't just their cable connection. They had somehow managed to slip into their next-door neighbor's Wi-Fi. They didn't pay for internet of their own, claiming it was too expensive for what it's worth. Instead, Janice had once caught sight of the neighbor's teenage son typing in a Wi-Fi password, memorized the few letters she could catch, and guessed the rest until she cracked it. From that day forward, the sisters had a world of free internet at their fingertips. The discovery was like striking gold. Suddenly, they didn't have to ration their phone data or sit bored in silence. They had Netflix, YouTube, and endless streaming. Every night, Paula drowned herself in reality shows, cheering for contestants like she knew them personally. Janice watched crime documentaries and shouted at the screen as though she could solve the case better than the detectives. They grew so used to this stolen luxury that they didn't even see it as stealing. In their minds, it was their right. After all, why should the neighbors get all that speed and bandwidth to themselves? Sharing was only fair, wasn't it? Of course, the neighbors had no idea. They only noticed that their bills seemed to climb higher and higher each month, and their internet slowed down every evening at exactly the same time. At first, they blamed their service provider. Then they noticed that strange devices kept appearing on their router's connected devices list. That was when suspicion fell on the Karen sisters. It made sense no one else in the neighborhood had the gall to mooch so openly. The neighbors decided to take action quietly. One Sunday morning, while sipping coffee and scrolling through their bills, the husband muttered to his wife, "That's it, I'm changing the password." His wife agreed instantly, tired of watching movies buffer and video calls drop. Within minutes, the Wi-Fi was locked down with a new password, one far too complex for anyone to guess. It was a simple change, but it was enough to set off a storm. That very evening, the Karen sisters settled onto their couch as usual. Paula was already clutching a bowl of popcorn, humming happily as she navigated to Netflix. But instead of their favorite lineup of shows, the screen froze. A message popped up, "No internet connection." Paula blinked, tried again, and then turned to Janice with panic in her eyes. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice trembling as though she'd just discovered a family emergency. Janice snatched the remote and stabbed at the buttons. She switched apps, restarted the TV, even pulled out the Wi-Fi settings. But the truth was clear: their access was gone. The invisible cord that had fed their nights of free entertainment had been severed. "What do you mean there's no connection?" Janice barked as though the TV could answer. "It says we need a password," Paula whispered. "A new one." For a moment, the sisters sat in stunned silence. It was like waking up to find the electricity cut off or the fridge emptied overnight. Their cozy empire of freeloading had collapsed. Paula gasped suddenly, realizing something even worse. Janice, Netflix isn't working either. We're logged out. The horror sank in slowly but deeply. They weren't just cut off from Wi-Fi. They were locked out of their neighbor's Netflix account too. The account that had automatically kept them signed in for months. No more reality shows. No more documentaries. No more nightly escapes. Their kingdom had crumbled in a single keystroke from across the fence. At first they tried to rationalize it. Maybe it's a service outage, Janice muttered, pacing back and forth. Maybe everyone's Wi-Fi is down. But a quick peek outside told another story. Lights glowed in windows all along the street, and other families were happily streaming and scrolling without issue. It was just them. Paula began to wail dramatically, clutching the empty popcorn bowl to her chest. They can't do this to us. We need this. How are we supposed to survive without our shows? Janice clenched her fists, her face twisting with rage. They think they can just cut us off. After all these months. This is personal. This is war. She stormed to the window and pulled back the curtain, glaring at the neighbor's house as if she could burn a hole through the walls with her eyes. Inside, the family was laughing around their own television, completely unaware of the storm brewing next door. Paula sniffled and looked at her sister. What are we going to do? Janice's answer came in a low, furious growl. We're going to march over there tomorrow and demand they fix this. They owe us. It was a statement that made sense only in the twisted logic of the Karen sisters. To them, using someone else's Wi-Fi wasn't stealing it, was simply taking what they deserved. And being cut off wasn't the neighbor's right, it was an act of betrayal. That as the night dragged on, the sisters sat in restless silence, their screens dark and their hands twitching for the remotes they could no longer use. Anger simmered inside them, growing hotter with every minute. By the time the sun rose, their fury was ready to spill over, and the quiet street was about to witness a meltdown it would never forget. The next morning began with the Karen sisters already in a mood. Janice woke first, stomping around the kitchen in her robe and slippers, banging cupboards shut as if she were fighting a war with the furniture. She made herself coffee, bitter and strong, and muttered under her breath about selfish neighbors who had dared to cross her. Paula shuffled in a little later, her hair messy, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. She tapped the screen again and again, only to be greeted by the same dreaded words, no connection. Her face crumpled, like she was staring at a death notice. I can't even check my Facebook, Paula moaned dramatically, sinking into a chair. Do you understand? I don't know what's happening in my groups. My friends probably think I disappeared. Janice rolled her eyes, though the truth was she was just as restless. She had spent years being the loudest voice in every room, the type of person who always had an opinion ready to fire. But now, without her endless documentaries and late-night streaming, she felt hollow, restless, even powerless. She wasn't about to admit that, not even to her sister. But the lack of Wi-Fi was gnawing at her like hunger. By mid-morning the decision was made. They weren't going to wait for things to magically fix themselves. No, the sisters were going to march across the lawn and demand answers. Janice changed into what she called her serious clothes, a stiff button-up shirt and wide-legged pants that made her look like a principal about to scold students. Paula threw on a floral blouse, applied a heavy smear of lipstick, and added oversized sunglasses that made her look like she was preparing for paparazzi rather than a confrontation with neighbors. Together, they strutted out of their house, their anger fueling every step. The neighbors, Mark and Linda, were in their front yard, tending to their flower bed. It was a peaceful Sunday morning, and the couple was enjoying the sunshine. They were laughing about something, their young son chasing a butterfly nearby. To the Karen sisters, this scene of calm happiness felt like an insult. Janice cleared her throat loudly, making sure all attention turned toward her. Excuse me, she barked, her voice sharp enough to make the boy pause mid. We need to talk. Mark looked up, blinking in confusion. Morning, he said cautiously. What's going on? Janice crossed her arms, standing tall like a general preparing for battle. You changed your Wi-Fi password, didn't you? There was a pause as Linda and Mark exchanged a baffled look. It wasn't the sort of accusation people expected to hear on a sunny morning. Mark frowned. Well, yeah, we did. Well, Paula gasped as though she'd been slapped. She pushed her sunglasses up and stared at him with wide, offended eyes. You admit it. You actually admit cutting us off like that. Mark tilted his head, confused. Cutting you off. It's our Wi-Fi. We were just securing it. Janice's face turned red. You don't understand. We've been using that Wi-Fi for months, and now all of a sudden you decide to be selfish. Do you know what kind of hardship you've caused us? We can't stream. We can't work. We can't work. Linda cut in with a laugh she couldn't suppress. You don't even have jobs. The neighbors across the street had begun to notice the commotion. Curtains twitched, and a few doors opened as people stepped outside to see what was happening. The Karen sisters thrived on attention, and instead of being embarrassed, they seemed to grow stronger under the spotlight. Paula clutched her chest dramatically, staggering a step as if the weight of the injustice were physically crushing her. This isn't just about us, she wailed. This is about community, about fairness, about sharing resources. What gives you the right to hoard your Wi-Fi while others suffer? A laugh broke out from someone watching across the street. A young man watering his lawn shouted, "It's literally their internet. By your own." His words drew chuckles from others, but the sisters ignored them. Janice jabbed a finger toward Mark and Linda. "We demand that you give us the new password immediately. This has gone far enough." Mark's patience was thinning. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. That's our Wi-Fi. You were never supposed to use it. If you need internet, call the provider and get your own service like everyone else." For a moment, silence hung in the air. The Karen sisters were stunned not because they didn't expect resistance, but because they weren't used to being told no. They had built their lives around pushing people until they got their way. But this time, the words landed like a door slamming shut. Paula's lips trembled. "No Netflix," she whispered, as if repeating it out loud would somehow make it untrue. Janice straightened her shoulders, her anger bubbling again. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You can't treat neighbors this way. We'll report you. We'll tell everyone what kind of people you really are." Mark's wife crossed her arms. "Go ahead," she said firmly. "The whole street is watching, and I think they already see exactly what kind of people you are." The sting of those words rippled through the crowd. The neighbors nearby nodded, some smirking, others shaking their heads. The Karen sisters had wanted sympathy, but instead, they had exposed themselves as entitled freeloaders. The humiliation was almost unbearable. Still, they refused to back down. With dramatic stomps, the sisters turned on their heels and stormed back to their house, their heads held high as though they had won some unseen battle. But behind their sunglasses and stiff posture, the truth was gnawing at them. Their free ride was over, and everyone knew it. Back inside the house, Paula collapsed onto the couch, covering her face with her hands. "They're monsters," she whispered. "Absolute monsters. How could they do this to us?" Janice paced the room, her mind racing. She wasn't ready to admit defeat. In her world, there was always a way to twist reality until she came out on top. "We're not done," she muttered. "If they think they can embarrass us, they've got another thing coming. We'll make them sorry they ever crossed us." As the day wore on, the sisters schemed. They talked about spreading rumors, about rallying the other neighbors to their side, even about filing false complaints. Anything to make life difficult for the family that had dared to lock them out. Their obsession with revenge grew stronger with each passing hour, fed by the silence of their blank TV screen. The peaceful street, once used to their petty complaints, was about to witness something far bigger, a full-scale war of pride and entitlement, ignited by nothing more than a Wi-Fi password. And in the center of it all stood the Karen sisters, determined to fight for what was never theirs to begin with. The following morning, the Karen sisters woke up with fresh determination. The sting of humiliation from the previous day had not faded. If anything, it had hardened into a stubborn resolve. In their minds, they had not been defeated, they had merely been misunderstood. All they needed, they told themselves, was to make the neighborhood see the situation from their perspective. If they could convince enough people that Mark and Linda were selfish, greedy, and unkind, then perhaps the tide would turn in their favor. Paula took the lead in dramatics. She threw on a flowy scarf and held a notebook, as if she was some kind of activist organizing a petition. "We'll call it Wi-Fi for all," she declared, her voice trembling with false nobility. "People will admire us for standing up for fairness." Janice, never one to shy away from confrontation, agreed. "We'll go door to door. We'll explain how Mark and Linda are hogging resources while the rest of us suffer. Once the neighbors understand, they'll pressure them to share. And if not, at least we'll ruin their reputation." So off they went, strutting from one house to the next like missionaries spreading the gospel of entitlement. Their first stop was Mr. Alvarez, a retired schoolteacher who spent most mornings reading on his porch. Paula launched into her speech with practiced theatrics. "Good morning, Mr. Alvarez," she began, clutching her scarf like a martyr. "We've come to speak about a serious issue that affects all of us in this community. Our neighbors, Mark and Linda, have cruelly cut us off from internet access, even though we've relied on it for months. Don't you think that's selfish? Don't you think neighbors should share?" Mr. Alvarez lowered his book slowly and looked at them over the rim of his glasses. His expression was one of disbelief rather than sympathy. "Are you telling me you were stealing their Wi-Fi and now you're upset they stopped you?" he asked bluntly. "It wasn't stealing," Janice snapped quickly. "It was borrowing. There's a difference. Borrowing means you ask permission." Mr. Alvarez replied calmly. "Did you ask?" The silence that followed answered the question. With a shake of his head, Mr. Alvarez returned to his book. "You should be ashamed of yourselves. Leave me out of this nonsense." Undeterred, the sisters moved on to the next house, but the pattern repeated itself again and again. The Parkers laughed in their faces. The Nguyen family politely closed the door mid-speech. Mrs. Hill, who usually tried to stay neutral in neighborhood disputes, gave them a scolding lecture about respecting other people's property. Each rejection only fueled the sisters' sense of persecution. By the time they reached the 10th house, Paula's scarf was drooping and her voice was hoarse from shouting. Janice's cheeks were red from frustration, but still, they pressed on, convinced that anyone would take their side. Finally, they approached the Johnsons' home where a group of younger neighbors were sitting on the porch drinking iced tea. The sisters launched into their speech again, but before they could finish, one of the young men burst out laughing. "You're serious?" he asked between chuckles. "You're trying to start a petition because someone stopped you from stealing their Wi-Fi." "It's not stealing," Paula cried, stamping her foot like a child denied candy. "It's community sharing." Another neighbor pulled out his phone and began recording the exchange. "Say that again," he teased, "so everyone online can hear how entitled you sound." The Karen sisters didn't notice immediately, but within hours, the video would spread across the neighborhood's private Facebook group. Dozens of comments would pile up, mocking the sisters and their absurd campaign. By the end of the day, the Karen sisters would be infamous. Not just annoying, but in that moment, still unaware of the online storm brewing. They stomped away from the Johnsons' house with their heads held high, convinced that their message had been misunderstood. "They'll see," Janice muttered, her jaw tight. "They'll all see once we explain it the right way." When they returned home, Paula collapsed on the couch with a dramatic sigh. "It's hopeless. They're all brainwashed. They think Mark and Linda are saints when really they're tyrants." Janice paced the room, her mind racing. "No, it's not hopeless. We just need to hit them where it hurts. If we can't turn the neighbors against them, maybe we can make life so difficult for Mark and Linda that they'll give in just to shut us up." Paula perked up at that. "Like complaints? Reports making them look bad?" "Exactly," Janice said, her eyes gleaming with malice. "We'll call the homeowners association. We'll complain about noise, about weeds in their yard, about anything we can think of. We'll call the city if we have to. We'll bury them in paperwork until they break." It was a plan born not of logic but of spite. The sisters were no longer just angry about the Wi-Fi, they were angry about losing face, about being laughed at, about not being able to bend the neighborhood to their will. In their world, this wasn't about internet access anymore. It was about power. That night, as the rest of the neighborhood scrolled happily through their phones and streamed their shows in peace, the Karen sisters sat in their darkened living room, plotting like villains in a low-budget drama. They scribbled lists of grievances, exaggerated every small detail they could remember about Mark and Linda, and rehearsed speeches filled with words like justice, fairness, and rights. But outside their walls, the truth was spreading faster than their lies. The video of their porch confrontation was racking up views. Neighbors were sending screenshots of their ridiculous complaints, and the sisters' reputation, already fragile, was crumbling beyond repair by the time they finally went to bed, convinced that tomorrow would bring them victory. The entire neighborhood was already united against them. The battle they thought they were winning was one they had already lost, and the more they fought, the deeper the hole they were digging. The Karen sisters woke up the next morning with renewed purpose. The sting of rejection from their neighbors the day before still burned, but rather than discouraging them, it only hardened their resolve. In their minds, they were victims of an injustice too great to ignore. They convinced themselves that their failure to rally support was not because their cause was ridiculous, but because the rest of the neighborhood was either too timid or too misinformed to see the truth. If persuasion hadn't worked, then pressure and intimidation would. Janice was the architect of the plan. She sat at the dining table with a notepad, scribbling furiously. "We'll start small," she declared, tapping the paper as though she were presenting a business strategy. "Noise complaints, yard violations, anything that makes Mark and Linda look like bad neighbors. Once the homeowners association is flooded with issues, they'll have no choice but to act. Then everyone will see we were right all along." Paula, always more dramatic than strategic, clapped her hands eagerly. "Yes, we'll show them what happens when you cross us. They think they can humiliate us. Huh, just wait." The sisters wasted no time. That very afternoon, Janice picked up the phone and dialed the HOA office. With her best authoritative tone, she launched into a tirade about Mark and Linda. She claimed their dog barked incessantly through the night, disturbing her peace. She insisted their grass was too long, their trash bins were left out too late, and their holiday lights from last year were still hanging, though none of it was true. She ended with a flourish, demanding immediate action. The representative on the other end listened politely, but there was a note of weariness in his voice. "Thank you, ma'am. We'll make a note of it," he said flatly. When Janice hung up, she smirked with satisfaction, already imagining HOA inspectors knocking on Mark and Linda's door. Meanwhile, Paula took to social media. She posted long, self-righteous paragraphs in the community Facebook group, painting herself and her sister as martyrs who had been denied basic digital rights. She accused Mark and Linda of being selfish, unneighborly, and even cyberbullies to her horror. Instead of gaining sympathy, her posts quickly filled with sarcastic comments and laughing emojis. One neighbor wrote, "Digital rights. It's not your Wi-Fi, Paula." Another chimed in, "Just buy your own internet like literally everyone else." The thread spiraled into a cascade of jokes at their expense. Still, the sisters refused to see the truth. "They're all jealous," Paula muttered, scrolling furiously through the comments. "They are just defending Mark and Linda because they don't want us to win." Janice nodded firmly. "Let them laugh. The more they underestimate us, the bigger their shock will be when we bring them down." Over the next few days, the complaints escalated. They called animal control, claiming Mark and Linda's perfectly well-behaved dog was aggressive. They phoned the city to report illegal construction on the family's backyard deck, though no such project existed. They even filed a noise complaint with the police, claiming loud parties were keeping them awake, despite the fact that Mark and Linda had been quietly watching movies with their son at the time. But instead of harming Mark and Linda, the plan began to unravel quickly. Every agency and official who followed up found nothing wrong. The HOA sent an inspector, who reported back that the lawn was immaculate, the trash bins properly stored, and the holiday lights non-existent. Animal control visited, petted the friendly golden retriever, and left with a smile. The police, after being called twice in 1 week, began to see the complaints for what they were: false reports fueled by spite. Word spread fast. Neighbors whispered about the sisters' antics, shaking their heads at the childish behavior. Many had already seen the video of their Wi-Fi crusade online, and this only added fuel to the fire. Now, instead of being viewed as victims or even nuisances, the Karen sisters were seen as outright troublemakers. Mark and Linda, though initially frustrated by the harassment, decided to handle it differently. Rather than shouting back or losing their tempers, they documented everything. Every false complaint, every unnecessary inspection, every online post. They kept careful records. Quietly, they began building a case. Meanwhile, the sisters grew increasingly desperate. Nights without Netflix were unbearable, and their schemes brought them no closer to their goal. Paula wandered the house restlessly, whining about missing her favorite shows. "Everyone else is watching the new season," she moaned. "They're talking about it online and I don't understand any of it. We're being left behind." Janice's frustration boiled over in different ways. She stomped around, ranting about how the world had become selfish and ungrateful. People used to help their neighbors, she snapped one evening. Now it's all about hoarding resources. Mark and Linda are the problem with society. Their bitterness grew so heavy that it consumed their days. Instead of enjoying the sunshine or talking to each other about anything else, they plotted endlessly about how to regain what they had lost. But the more they plotted, the clearer it became. They were losing not just Wi-Fi but the goodwill of the entire neighborhood by the end of the week. Their reputations had collapsed completely. Neighbors avoided eye contact when passing them on the street. Conversations stopped abruptly when they appeared, whispers following them instead. The once feared double trouble of Elm Street had become the street's biggest joke. One evening, as they sat in their living room surrounded by dark, silent screens, Paula burst into tears. "It's not fair," she sobbed. "We used to be respected. People used to listen to us." Janice sat beside her, staring blankly at the wall. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind, but her pride wouldn't let her admit defeat. "Not yet. We'll find another way," she said stiffly. "They can't ignore us forever." What neither of them realized was that Mark and Linda weren't just ignoring them, they were preparing a counterstrike, and when it came, it would be decisive. The Karen sisters thought they were still playing the game, but in truth, the game was already over. They had crossed a line they could never uncross, and the fallout was about to arrive with a force they could not control. The storm finally broke 2 weeks after the Karen sisters had launched their campaign of complaints. By then, the neighborhood was fed up. The HOA office was tired of hearing their exaggerated claims. The police were annoyed at being called out for nonsense, and every resident on the street had grown weary of their endless theatrics. What the sisters did not know was that Mark and Linda had quietly gathered every piece of evidence needed to expose them completely. One bright Saturday morning, the HOA organized a community meeting at the park, a routine gathering to discuss upcoming projects, budgets, and maintenance. But this meeting promised more drama than usual, because Mark and Linda had requested time to present something important. Nearly every family in the neighborhood showed up, curious about what was coming. Children played on the grass, couples set up folding chairs, and the air buzzed with anticipation. The Karen sisters arrived late, as they often did, sweeping into the crowd with an air of self-importance. Janice wore a blazer, determined to look authoritative, while Paula wore oversized sunglasses and carried her notebook like a badge of honor. They whispered to each other as they took seats near the front, convinced that today would finally vindicate them. Surely, they thought, the HOA would hear their complaints about Mark and Linda and force them to share their Wi-Fi. When Mark and Linda stood up to speak, the sisters leaned forward eagerly. Mark began calmly, holding a folder of papers. "We've been the target of repeated false complaints over the past 2 weeks, he said, his voice steady. "Noise complaints, yard violations, even reports of aggressive pets. Every time, officials came to check and found nothing wrong. At first we were just frustrated, but then we realized the pattern." He opened the folder and held up copies of documents, police reports, animal control visits, HOA inspection notes. Every single one of these complaints was made by the same source: our neighbors, Janice and Paula. The crowd gasped, though most of them weren't surprised. They had already suspected as much. The sisters stiffened, glancing at each other nervously, but Janice quickly lifted her chin in defiance. "We had every right to make those reports," she said loudly. "You've been a nuisance, and someone had to hold you accountable." Linda stepped forward then, holding her phone. "Really?" she asked. Because it seems to me you were more interested in revenge than accountability. She tapped the screen and began playing a video one the neighbors had already seen in the Facebook group. It showed the sisters on the Johnsons' porch, demanding digital rights and insisting that Wi-Fi should be shared by the whole community. The crowd burst into laughter, the sound echoing across the park. Paula's face turned red beneath her sunglasses. That video was taken out of context, she shrieked, but Mark wasn't finished. He held up another sheet, this one containing screenshots of the sisters' Facebook rants, complete with accusations and melodramatic claims. They tried to turn the neighborhood against us, he continued, but all they managed to do was embarrass themselves. And now, after filing false reports and harassing us, we're asking the HOA to take formal action. The HOA president, a stern woman named Mrs. Carter, stood and cleared her throat. Janice, Paula, she said firmly, we've received more than a dozen complaints about your behavior in the past month, not from you, but about you. This community values respect, not harassment. From this point forward, any false report you file will result in fines. If it continues, we'll pursue legal action. The sisters were stunned. For once, words failed them. They had come expecting sympathy and power, but instead they were being scolded like children in front of the entire neighborhood. The laughter and whispers around them only made the humiliation worse. Paula began to cry softly, hiding her face behind her scarf, while Janice clenched her fists, her face pale with fury. But it was too late. The tide had turned, and there was no going back. Their neighbors, once tolerant of their antics, were now united against them. People shook hands with Mark and Linda, offering support and congratulations for standing up to the bullies. The sisters, meanwhile, slipped away from the gathering as quietly as they could, their heads lowered, their pride shattered. Back at their house, the silence was unbearable. The TV still sat dark, Netflix locked away forever. The sisters sat side by side on the couch, not speaking. For the first time in a long while they felt powerless. Their empire of entitlement had collapsed, and there was no one left to blame but themselves. Janice broke the silence at last, her voice low and bitter. They'll regret this one day, she muttered, but the words rang hollow, even to her own ears. Deep down, she knew the war was over. Paula sniffled, wiping her eyes. I just wanted to watch my shows, she whispered. Outside, life in the neighborhood carried on. Families returned from the meeting with smiles. Children rode bikes down the street, and Mark and Linda sat on their porch enjoying a peaceful afternoon. The Karen sisters, once loud and overbearing, had been reduced to shadows behind closed curtains, their voices drowned out by the laughter of those who had finally stood up to them. The story of the Wi-Fi war became a cautionary tale, retold with chuckles at block parties and whispered with amusement to new neighbors who moved in. And though the sisters never admitted defeat, the neighborhood knew the truth. They had been beaten by their own arrogance. In the end, the very thing they had fought hardest to keep, the illusion of control, was the one thing they lost completely.